was crowned in silence, not in marble halls, but in the shadows of a private chamber where no crowds gathered and no anthems played. There were no laurels, no acclamations, no Senate decrees proclaiming his rise. Only the cold fingers of imperial attendants fastening a diadem onto his head while he bled onto the marble floor. The boy did not flinch. He did not scream. Pain had become a language he had long since learned to speak without sound. Around him, the perfumed air of the palace was heavy with incense and expectation. He was to be presented not as a monarch in his own right, but as a gift, an offering sculpted into perfection for a man who called himself divine. He was perhaps 15 or 14. His name had once belonged to kings, but it would be erased before the month was done. In its place, he would wear another's memory, another's shape, another's shame, and the moment the blade severed the part of him that could still claim a future, he became not a boy, not a ruler, but an ornament. The boy monarch had cut himself open, not for faith, not for politics, but for love, or something that once pretended to be love, before it drowned in the sea of a madman's desire. To the outside world, he was simply another palace youth, another fragile beauty moving silently through the corridors of power. The empire had seen many such figures, concubines, playthings, servants who knew to avert their eyes when the gods of the earth passed by. But within the inner court, where rumor moved faster than blood and obedience was currency, they whispered the truth. He was the favorite, and not just a favorite, but the chosen twin of someone long dead, a replacement, a living echo, a reanimation sculpted in flesh, trimmed and reshaped until the emperor could believe in ghosts again. The emperor was not simply a tyrant. He was a maker of myths, a destroyer of identities, and a lover who mistook obedience for affection. And the boy, desperate to survive, and more desperately still to be seen, had submitted to the most irreversible act imaginable. He had chosen mutilation over invisibility, sacrifice over selfhood. He had become beautiful in the way statues are beautiful, motionless, voiceless, eternal. But the flesh that bled beneath the crown did not forget, and neither did history, though it tried to look away. To understand how such horror could unfold, one must trace the path not only of the boy, but of the man who destroyed him, not with whips or prisons, but with longing. The man called himself a god, but was born in pain. Gaius Julius Caesar, Augustus Germanicus, known to history as Caligula, entered the world surrounded by adoration. The son of beloved General Germanicus and the darling of the Roman legions, he grew up bathed in affection that bordered on religious devotion. As a child, he marched in miniature armor beside his father's troops, earning the nickname Little Boots. But love in Rome is never safe, and adoration never lasts. At just 7 years old, he watched his father die under suspicious circumstances, likely poisoned by imperial enemies. His mother was exiled, his brothers executed, and he, the golden child, was forced to smile and bow in the court of the very man who had destroyed his family. That man was Tiberius, emperor of Rome, master of cruelty, a figure so consumed by paranoia that he filled his island retreat with orgies and informers alike. There, Caligula learned the rules of survival. Trust no one, show no fear, and make suffering your ally. By the time he ascended the throne at age 24, the boy who had once played in the camps of loyal soldiers was gone. In his place stood a man who believed that pain was love, and that the only honest emotion was fear. At first, the people rejoiced. After the cold, dying years of Tiberius, Caligula seemed like a promise, A new dawn, a return to the glory of Augustus. He granted bonuses to the soldiers, staged vast public games, pardoned prisoners, and declared himself devoted to liberty. For a brief moment, Rome believed again. But it was only a mask. And masks, in time, crack. Within months, the emperor fell into a fever that nearly killed him. When he awoke, something had changed. Historians debate whether it was brain damage, psychological collapse, or simply the unveiling of what had always lain beneath. But what followed was not governance. It was theatre. Tragic, brutal, and obscene. Caligula declared himself a living god. He built temples to his own divinity. He demanded to be worshipped in the streets. He executed senators for looking bored. He laughed as he forced noblemen to commit suicide in front of their families. He made his horse a priest. But amid the chaos and bloodshed, there was one obsession that eclipsed all others. The need to recreate what he had lost. A sister. A love. A shadow from the past. Her name was Drusilla, and she had been the only person Caligula ever seemed to love without cruelty. When she died, likely from fever, he declared her a goddess, built altars to her memory, and descended into a grief that would become the foundation for his next nightmare. That nightmare would be built on flesh. He began searching, not openly, but through whispers and bribes, for a boy, a youth with the eyes of Drusilla, the mouth of Drusilla, the voice that reminded him of everything he could not bear to forget. And when the boy was found, young, noble-born, beautiful in the Roman ideal, he was summoned not as a guest, but as a vessel. Caligula did not demand his love, he demanded his transformation. The boy was told that if he wished to remain in favor, if he wished to ascend beyond the reach of the common and the disposable, he must become worthy of the emperor's devotion. He must offer proof, not of loyalty, but of surrender. And so he did. He gave up the thing that made him a man. The act itself was never recorded in detail, and perhaps that is mercy. But the silence of the sources only sharpens the horror. For what is left unsaid becomes a canvas for the darkest imagination. Whether he used a blade of his own, or whether it was done by imperial physicians under Caligula's command, the result was the same. A young noble, groomed for statesmanship or battle, was converted into something else entirely. A living relic to satisfy the god-emperor's grief-stricken fantasy. In Roman eyes, manhood was not a metaphor. It was tangible, anatomical, sacred. To lose it was to fall from the ranks of citizen and soldier into something unnameable. Yet here was a boy, royal in birth, cutting the thread of his own destiny just to be loved, just to be seen, or perhaps just to survive. He was renamed, dressed, reintroduced at court not as a eunuch, not as a boy, but as a woman, in fine silks, gilded sandals, eyes lined with kohl, and lips tinted with cinnabar. He was unveiled at a feast as the bride of the emperor, to the shocked silence of Rome's elite. They toasted, they bowed, they congratulated. No one dared look too long. Everyone knew, and no one dared speak. Caligula called him Drusilla, sometimes even Venus. When seated at banquets, the emperor would stroke his cheek with the reverence of a priest before an idol. He paraded him through the streets in a litter draped with purple cloth, flanked by guards, as crowds were commanded to cheer, not for a triumph of arms, but for the return of a goddess in boy skin. Senators whispered behind closed doors that this was madness made flesh, but they whispered only because Caligula listened and Caligula punished. One consul who scoffed too loudly at a private gathering was invited to dinner and served the decapitated heads of his own sons beneath a silver platter. No one laughed again, in the imperial court, reality bent to the will of one man's delusion, and the boy, who had once read Virgil in the quiet gardens of his family's estate, now lived in the golden cage of a fiction so complete it became law. To outsiders, the transformation was grotesque, but to Caligula, it was sacred. He believed he had done what no mortal could, brought back the dead, not through sorcery, but through devotion. And the boy, now neither monarch nor man, played his part with the desperation of someone who knew what happened to those who failed. He learned to smile on cue, to weep when spoken to tenderly, to mimic the gestures of Roman matrons and the voice of a sister long gone. Every movement was studied, every breath choreographed. Behind the heavy painted doors of the palace, he was taught by older court eunuchs how to exist in a space between genders, between lives, between the past and the living present. And in the silence of the night, when the court grew still and only torchlight flickered in the marble corridors, he would sit alone in the perfumed shadows, touching the scars that now defined his body, wondering what part of himself had survived the performance. There were moments when even Caligula seemed to see the fracture. Moments when his affection twisted into fury, when he would accuse the boy of deceiving him, of not being truly Drusilla, of mocking his grief. Once, during a thunderstorm, the emperor screamed at the sky, accusing Jupiter himself of jealousy, and then struck the boy across the face so violently that a tooth broke loose and scattered across the floor like a lost coin. The next morning, he kissed the wound and adorned it with gold leaf, as if pain could be gilded into devotion. And the boy, ever compliant, ever silent, nodded as though this was love, because to deny it would be to die. And then, just as swiftly as the madness had lifted him to Olympus, Caligula's reign collapsed into the abyss. In January of 41 AD, only 4 years after he took power, the emperor was cornered in a palace corridor by members of the Praetorian Guard and stabbed dozens of times until his body became unrecognizable. His blood pooled into the mosaics of the hallway, where he had once declared himself eternal. The courtiers rejoiced. The Senate, shaken but relieved, rushed to erase his decrees, dismantle his shrines, and restore a facade of order. But in the middle of that swift political cleansing, one figure was left behind: the boy bride, the ornament, the phantom queen. Without Caligula, he had no protector, no role, no identity. The new emperor, Claudius, wanted nothing to do with his predecessor's grotesque creations. He was dismissed from the palace without ceremony, stripped of titles, guards, and income. What followed was not exile, it was erasure. He drifted through the margins of Rome like a ghost, too solid to ignore, but too shameful to name. No longer monarch, no longer beloved, no longer anyone's possession, and yet not free. The city that once bowed before his chariot now looked through him, its citizens trained to forget what had so recently been law, ceremony, spectacle. In taverns and marketplaces, they spoke of Caligula's reign with a smirk or a shudder, recalling the horse in the Senate, the incestuous rumors, the divine declarations, but rarely the boy whose mutilation had been its most intimate horror. For the senators, he was an embarrassment, a lingering echo of a madman's dream. For the new regime, he was a liability, a breathing relic of a time everyone wanted buried. No one wanted to ask what had become of him, what he ate, where he slept, what he remembered. Rome had always been merciless to those who survived its monsters. He lived, if it could be called that, under the protection of a former slave in the Subura district, far from marble halls, far from perfume and silk. The people around him called him Venia, a name that meant forgiveness, or perhaps permission. But no one knew his real name anymore. He never spoke of it. He moved through each day wrapped in veils and layers, his eyes sunken but alert, his mouth often pressed tight as if it were still forbidden to speak. The scars on his body never faded, but they were not what haunted him. It was the memory of love offered like a throne and taken like a sentence. He had not loved Caligula, not truly, not freely, but he had needed him, had believed for one moment, one breath, that to be needed in return was enough. And now, with the tyrant dead and the city reborn in fragile sanity, he found himself alive in a world that had no place for him. Years passed. Claudius was poisoned. Nero rose. And with him came new spectacles, new degradations, new victims. The empire consumed lives like grain, and the boy-turned-widow watched from the margins as others were transformed into living monuments of someone else's grief, desire, or delusion. He saw another youth, Sporus, taken by Nero and forced into the role of another dead empress, dressed, renamed, broken. The echoes were too perfect. Rome had learned nothing. The machinery of transformation, of erasure, of ritualized humiliation had not ended with Caligula. It had simply changed hands. And he, who had once been the model, the prototype of imperial violation, saw his reflection multiply in the faces of others. Each new doll created in the image of a lost woman. Each new boy paraded as a goddess. He wanted to look away, but he could not. Because if they were not remembered, then neither was he. In his final years, he began to write, not memoirs, not pleas for justice, but names. He kept a list of every boy, every girl, every man and woman he had known who had disappeared into the dark chambers of emperors and never emerged. Not their titles, not their crimes, only their names as he remembered them. Before they were changed, before they were dressed in lies, he folded the parchment and buried it beneath a tile in the room where he slept. It was all he could do. His own name, the one he had lost, the one that had once promised sovereignty, he never wrote down. It belonged to a person who no longer existed. And then, one morning, he did not rise. The old woman who brought him bread found him cold and rigid, his hands folded neatly, his face composed. No sign of poison, no mark of violence, only a stillness that had been coming for years. He had died not in protest, not in despair, but in quiet release. Perhaps at last, he had found a space beyond performance, beyond obedience, beyond fear. Rome did not notice. No funeral, no pyre, no tomb. His body was cremated with others in a common fire, his ashes scattered in a place with no name. History, as always, turned the page, but the memory of him, not as a monarch, not as a bride, but as a boy who castrated himself to please his tyrant, refused to die. In every whispered story of courtly depravity, his ghost lingered. In every chronicle that recorded Caligula's madness, he was there, unnamed but necessary. His mutilation was the measure of another man's power. His silence, the backdrop to another's divinity. He was not remembered as a ruler, nor as a martyr, but as a warning that in empires ruled by obsession, the greatest sacrifice is not the one made in battle, but the one made in the bedroom, and that perhaps the most tragic monarch Rome ever produced was the one whose crown was soaked in his own blood.